That's right. Sailing the seas depends upon the helmsman, as the song says. This is a song designed to whip the Chinese proletariat into a patriotic frenzy for the man they call the Great Helmsman, Chairman Mao. Well, here on the History of Being Human podcast, we are still sailing the seas of the dumbest things ever. And today's guest of special distinction is indeed Chairman Mao. The Great Helmsman, the brain power behind what I consider one of the dumbest things ever. The worst failure of central planning in all history as far as I can tell. A tragedy that was greatly compounded by a bullheaded refusal to abandon it, even when its failure was obvious, and turned into a moral outrage by a campaign of human rights abuses, torture, and terror, the likes of which history has seldom seen. That's right, I'm talking about the Great Leap Forward, a name that has forever after ruined the concept of irony for everything else. I think it's safe to say that some of the dumbest things in history, some of the worst disasters and total fails, come about because you have a supreme ruler who lives in a narcissistic amplification chamber, with everyone around them either too terrified or too sycophantic to push back against their dumber impulses. So let that be a warning to all you nascent authoritarians out there. Today's episode is an example of exactly that. I'm talking about the Great Leap Forward, which is actually the Great Lurch Backward, the Great Crash Downward. Whatever else you want to call it would be much more accurate than a Great Leap Forward. Yes, it was a humanitarian crisis. It was a nightmare of human suffering on a scale we can't even imagine. And so I really could have put this episode into a few different categories. But I chose to put it into this series on the dumbest things ever, because to me, the Great Leap Forward's most defining characteristic, its most salient trait, is how incomprehensibly stupid it was. Now, I know what you're thinking. I have the benefit of looking at it in hindsight. It's easy to judge the past by the standards of the present. But I can't help but get the feeling that all of the suffering, the human misery, the terrible toll that it exacted was gratuitous, totally unnecessary, and could have been prevented with even a modicum of common sense. The 20th century was a century of large-scale horror. Just in the sheer numbers of violent deaths, the 20th century stands out above any other. I don't just mean World Wars I and II and Korea and Vietnam. There were also atrocities, the Armenian genocide in which 1.5 million ethnic Armenians were expelled or killed by the Ottomans, the Holocaust in which 6 to 10 million people died, the dekulakizations under Stalin in which maybe 6, maybe 10, maybe 15 million people died. The killing fields of the Khmer Rouge in which 1/4 of Cambodia's population of 8 million people were killed. But the one that, at least in the West, you usually don't include in that list is the one that dwarfs them all. The episode between 1958 and 1962 that is sometimes called the Great Chinese Famine or the Great Leap Forward. If you want to pretend that this was just a natural disaster, a drought that resulted in misery and suffering throughout China, then you call it the Great Chinese Famine. But that totally ignores the fact that this famine, this horror, was politically engineered, and it resulted in the deaths of between 30 and 50 million Chinese people. I know when the numbers get that high, it's hard to wrap your head around it. But essentially, if you cut off the entire state of California from all food, and watch the population starve to death over the course of 2 or 3 years, then you have the equivalent of the Great Leap Forward. This is how the historian Frank Dikotter put it. He said if you take what Pol Pot did in Cambodia, you multiply that by about 20, then you get somewhere close to what happened in China between 1958 and 1962. So you have to wonder if it was worse, at least in the sheer number of deaths, than the Holocaust, worse than the gulags and the dekulakizations and the killing fields. Why don't you hear more about it? Well, the answer is very simple. The regimes that perpetrated the Holocaust and the killing fields and the dekulakizations are gone. The Soviets are gone, the Nazis are gone, the Khmer Rouge is gone. But in China, the same Communist Party that oversaw the Great Leap Forward is still in power, and it still chooses to semi-canonize Mao Zedong himself. Even though they've totally abandoned Mao's economic models, he still serves as a figurehead for the Chinese Communist Party. He still confers legitimacy on their monopoly on power in China. So, of course, they're not going to want to highlight the nutty and brutal aspects of his leadership. But the historians that I've read make it very clear that this entire sordid episode can be laid in large part right at the feet of Chairman Mao. So what was the Great Leap Forward? It was a campaign which was orchestrated by Mao and the Chinese Communist Party beginning in 1958 to attempt to force China kicking and screaming into the modern age, 20th century levels of industrialization. Mao believed that in just 15 years, he could modernize China from a society that in many areas was still at near medieval levels of pastoral society into a socialist paradise of industry and agriculture that would be on par with the Western powerhouses like the US and Great Britain. And that's fine as far as it goes. You can't blame Mao or fault him for wanting to improve his country's standard of living. But the way he set about to do this is where the problem arises. So we have to go back and start somewhere. Let's start in 1927. A civil war breaks out between the CPC and the KMT. The CPC is the Communist Party of China, and the KMT is the Kuomintang. That'll be my one attempt to pronounce Mandarin. And I offer my apologies to those of you who know how to really pronounce it. But the point is, there's a civil war between the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao, and their battle goes on and on. They call a temporary truce during World War II. Why is that? Well, the Japanese Imperial Army has invaded China, and Joseph Stalin orders Mao to cooperate with the nationalists, with the KMT, to expel Japan from China. So there's a very reluctant truce called, and together they fight Imperial Japan until Japan surrenders in August of 1945. As soon as World War II's over, the CPC and KMT go back at it. That goes on for a few years, until 1949. January 1949, the Red Army storms into Beijing, drives out the last of the KMT, the nationalist forces, and the Civil War finally ends after 22 years. On the 1st of October 1949, Mao proclaims the founding of the People's Republic of China, the PRC. Chiang Kai-shek and 2 million KMT soldiers flee from China and go to Taiwan. Mao wanted China, the new communist China, to be a radical reinvention. He wanted to be free from all the traditions and religion and social order that he saw holding it back. That was the past. He wanted a new China. Now, at this time, the population of China was over 600 million. A lot of that was rural population, so Mao had set himself to a monumental task. But really, one of the reasons that people had supported Mao and his communist army was because he had promised them that he was going to build a more equitable society. The laborers, the peasants, were no longer going to break their backs and starve to death as the rulers and the landowners got rich. But Mao had a big problem. That is, China's long history, compounded by the Civil War and then World War II, had left China in a pretty primitive condition. Mao was going to need support if he was going to achieve his goals, because it was very poor and industrially very backwards, and its military was weak and arcane. So Mao reached out to the Soviets, to Stalin. Now, Mao looked up to Stalin not just because he was Mao's example of a true socialist leader, but even at the personal level, Stalin was Mao's hero. And there is a true mystery for you. Stalin was not exactly Mr. Charisma. But it was what it was. Mao really looked up to, almost worshipped the ground that Stalin walked on. So Mao travels to Russia to meet his hero and ask for military and economic aid. Mao must have been hurt and humiliated and confused when Stalin wouldn't meet with him for 2 full days. Wouldn't even give him an audience. Now look, I know schadenfreude is not an admirable emotion, but I have a hard time thinking it's too big of a tragedy when one brutal dictator hurts the feelings of another. But eventually they did meet, and they signed what's called the Treaty of Friendship. And the agreement involved Stalin giving Mao the equivalent of $300 million USD in a loan. It had to be paid back. But he also gave him huge quantities of Soviet military arms, along with tractors and other agricultural equipment and factory equipment. Along with that, Stalin was going to send thousands of Soviet advisors to guide China in its development. Of course, none of this came free, and China would be in great financial debt to the USSR because none of those things Stalin gave Mao were gifts. They were extended on credit, and they had to be repaid. So that was one of the conditions that contributed to the suffering of the Great Leap Forward. Another factor at play was what Mao called agricultural reform. What we might call it is the mass murder of landlords by their tenants and the seizure and redistribution of their lands to the peasant class. Now, the peasants loved that because they now had lands to farm. but the estimated amount of casualties this movement created ranges from hundreds of thousands to millions. It's very tough to get an accurate number. The Communist Party itself estimated that between 830,000 and 2 million landlords were killed during this time. 1.5 to 6 million were sent to reform through labor camps, where most of them died anyway. So this wasn't an ethnocide or a genocide, this was a pure classicide. Mao would instigate one classicide or another throughout his entire 30-year time as the head of the Chinese Communist Party, a very effective tool for entrenching loyalty, for punishing perceived enemies. But these class-based killings reached their apex between 1950 and 1953. And by the end of 1953, there were no landlords left in China. That whole class was gone. Those who hadn't been killed had fled for their lives to Taiwan. Mao carried out this classicide in a way that differed from the Soviets. When Stalin wanted somebody dead, or an entire class or group of people dead, he sent in the military or the police and had them killed. But Mao wanted the people themselves, the peasants themselves, to rise up and kill the landlords. Because by doing that, the people would not be passive observers. The way he described it was kind of like making your bones with the mob. Once you rise up and kill a landlord, you're permanently linked with the goals of the Chinese Communist Party and the Glorious Revolution. And that's why even today you can find videos and images on the internet of massive groups of peasants shame-marching a landlord to the middle of the square, where they yell at him, slap him, beat him, humiliate him, and we have to presume they eventually kill them. You might wonder how Mao could get peasants, whole groups of peasants, to commit actions that seemed lawless and brutal. And the obvious answer is that those same peasants had been oppressed by landlords who were themselves lawless and brutal for many generations. So even if you don't think it was the right way to go about it, it's not at all surprising that these oppressed peasants would rise up and seek revenge when they had the freedom to do it. The land reform campaign was vast in its scope, involving over 300 million peasants by the time it was through. The historian Walter Schneidel writes that the violence of the land reform campaign did at least have a significant impact on economic inequality. He writes the following, quote, "In one of the more thoroughly reformed regions in the north of the country, most landlords and rich peasants had lost all their land and often their lives or had fled. All formerly landless workers had received land, which eliminated the category of landless workers altogether. As a result, middling peasants, who now accounted for 90% of the village population, own 90.8% of the land, as close to perfect equality as one could possibly hope for." End quote. So after the land was confiscated, peasants were assigned a piece of land over which they had stewardship. And that seemed to work out very well. In 1951 and 1952, the peasants, who were the ones farming the land anyway, they knew how to do it. They were able to raise their own crops. They had plenty of food and surplus they could sell at the market and make actual money. So Mao's status became almost deific at this time. The peasants had never been so independent, so rich. They'd never had such a plenty of food and a surplus to go around. They began to worship Mao as one of the great emperors, just like the emperors of days gone by. He became the emperor of the new Red Dynasty. But this was, alas, to prove fairly short-lived. By 1953, Mao sees some trends in the land reform he didn't like at all. He had just eradicated the wealthy landholder class, and much to his chagrin, many of the peasants who were now growing their own crops were making money, were starting to save their money, and become successful. So in Mao's eyes, Napoleon was starting to look an awful lot like Farmer Pilkington. Little Animal Farm cut for you. So Mao was not about to sit idly by while a new landowner class rose up. So he took a trick out of Stalin, his hero's playbook. The only way he could prevent class distinctions would be to collectivize the agriculture. So that's what he did. The peasants who just 3 years earlier had been given this land had to give it back, and they had to collectivize into farms of up to 50 families. And as you can guess, this did not endear Mao to the peasants. They began to distrust him a little bit, but they did what they were told. They had no choice. Stalin died in that same year, 1953. If you're interested in that, I would refer you to episode 27, The Man of Steel, the second worst human being ever, as I call Stalin. But in that year, 1953, Stalin dies, and Mao is left without his mentor and his chief connection to the Soviet Union. But Stalin lives on in the heart and mind of Mao, despite the snub in Moscow years before. He always considered Stalin the ideal socialist leader. So Mao is already feeling a little adrift, already a little less connected to the Soviets. Well, imagine how much worse that got 3 years later, 1956, when Nikita Khrushchev gets up and does the unthinkable. In an event that really should have its own episode, the 20th Congress of the Communist Party. It's the first time they'd met since the death of Stalin. It's 3 years after Stalin died. Nobody during this Congress had spoken much about Stalin until the party secretary, Nikita Khrushchev, gets up and delivers a speech. He calls his speech, quote, "the personality cult and its consequences," end quote. This speech on the cult of personality is often considered Khrushchev's secret speech because it was delivered in a closed-door session. But there were 1,500 delegates and a lot of invited guests there too, so it wasn't all that secret. Word got out almost immediately, and it created a sensation, an uproar, because for 4 straight hours, Khrushchev denounced Stalin, every facet of his legacy. It was a world historic takedown. He said Stalin started a cult of personality, and then look at the consequences. The imprisonment, torture of loyal party members, executions, a reign of terror. Khrushchev blamed Stalin for all of the foreign policy mistakes of the Soviet Union, all of the failings of Soviet agriculture. He even went back to World War II and talked about how badly Stalin had bungled that, how he had essentially fed millions of Soviet lives into a meat grinder unnecessarily, and how he had lost large swaths of Soviet territory to German occupiers. All of Stalin's supposed legacy accomplishments, Khrushchev shot down with no mercy. It's rumored that the audience listening to Khrushchev just sat there in stunned silence. The only sound were shocked murmurs. The delegates just sat riveted in their seats. They didn't even dare look at each other. Maybe this was a trap. If they agree, if they clap, they would be executed. So for 4 straight hours, Khrushchev went on, and they just sat in their seats, barely able to move. And in this speech, for the first time, Stalin was called a dictator by his own people. And at the end of the speech, nobody applauded. People just stood up and shuffled out in stunned silence. I would submit that we who are used to iconoclasm can't really understand the effect this would have had on Khrushchev's audience. One observer put it this way, quote, "It was as if we had gone to Rome to hear the Pope speak, and the Pope had gotten up and told us there was no God," end quote. Another young party member named Alexander Yakovlev said this, quote, "Everything crumbled, never to be made whole again," end quote. It's a pretty gutsy move by Khrushchev. Could have gone either way for him. It created a furor in the Soviet Union, and there were still plenty of Stalin's henchmen around who didn't like to hear what he was saying. But as it actually worked out, Khrushchev was able to sway party opinion. He actually had them put out a statement a few months later saying the following, quote, "The Congress has called for measures for removing wholly and entirely the cult of the individual, which is foreign to Marxism-Leninism, in every aspect of party, governmental, and ideological activity," end quote. Essentially what they're saying, and everybody knew it, Stalin's personality cult was pretty bourgeois. And with that damning indictment, thousands of political prisoners who'd been imprisoned by Stalinist ideals were released. Others were posthumously rehabilitated. Their families benefited from this. And the Soviets declared that they would never allow anyone to hold dictatorial power again. Now imagine if you were a left-wing intellectual, or a Stalinist apologist, or a fanboy like Mao, and you had spent years denying the reports of human rights violations and abuses in the Soviet Union under Stalin. This would have cut the feet right out from under you. That's exactly what happened to Mao. Not only had Mao referenced Stalin several times as the ideal communist leader, he had patterned his own collectivist activities after the now denounced Stalinist collectivism. So Mao suffered a little setback in his status. Now, not only that, there were thousands of Russian advisors helping Mao to organize his collectivism. And when Stalin's entire model fell into disrepute, Mao's model also did in the eyes of those Soviet advisors. Mao was also fighting some pushback from the peasants, who, like I said, had just been given land 3 years before, and now Mao was trying to take it back in a Stalinist collectivist system. This left Mao feeling a little bit vulnerable. The collectivizations were halted, at least for the time. Then something else happened that really worried Mao. The nation of Hungary revolted against the yoke of Soviet oppression, and it required Soviet arms to bring Hungary back into line again. Mao thought if that could happen to the Soviet Union, If an entire nation could revolt against Soviet rule, that could happen in China also. So when Mao saw these factors coalescing somewhat against him, Stalinism out of favor, the potential for the peasants to rise up against the collectivizations, the revolt in Hungary, then Mao knew that it was very important for him to remain endeared to his people. So he saw that the Russians were liberalizing, being a little bit more responsive to their people. He decided that he should be too. So he initiated what was called the 100 Flowers Campaign. And while we may never know what his real motivations were when he started the campaign, we know what happened afterward. Mao said effectively, Stalinism has fallen into disfavor. We need guidance from the people. So he encouraged anyone with a gripe or a critique or misgivings of any kind about the way China is being run to come forward and speak freely. And Mao promoted this as a patriotic duty to promote the flourishing of the arts and the progress of science. And he based the name of this campaign on a famous quote from a poem that said, "Let 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend." As you can imagine, it took a lot of coaxing, but people eventually began to critique all kinds of things. Millions of letters of complaint poured in. University campuses, of course, became hotbeds of dissent. People actually began to put up posters around campuses, rallied in the streets, held meetings for CPC members, published magazine articles. So, for example, students at Peking University created a democratic wall on which they criticized the Communist Party of China with posters and letters. Specifically, they railed against its control over intellectuals, the harshness of its campaigns, the slavish following of these Soviet models, low standards of living in China, proscription of all foreign literature, economic corruption among party cadres, and the fact that the party members enjoyed many privileges which make them a race apart. You can tell that these were pointed and withering criticism, and a little too close to home. The party bosses did not like having it pointed out that they had become an elite class, the very thing they claimed to hate most of all. Altogether, it was just a little too much criticism. They ended up acting like Michael in the episode of The Office where he hosts a celebrity roast of himself, encourages all the workers to come up and roast him, and then gets really hurt and offended when they actually do. Well, they might have based that entire episode on the 100 Flowers campaign, but Michael did not have the power of life and death over his office workers like Mao had over his people. So after a brief period of openness, Mao dropped the hammer on anyone who had been foolish enough to take him at his word and criticize the party. All through 1957 through 1959, Mao, who was a leftist, if you listen to the last episode, launched what he called the anti-rightist campaign against anybody who had spoken out against the regime. Between 500,000 and 1 million citizens, mostly teachers, were rounded up in waves, publicly shamed and criticized and punched and beaten, and then sent off to forced re-education camps. Conditions in these camps were terrible. As many as 70% of the people sent to these camps during the anti-rightist campaigns died. Mao demanded that children report their parents, students report their professors, in a true Stalinist model. In fact, one of Mao's favorite techniques was to take the letters that people had written criticizing him, pin them to the chest of the writer, and force that person to stand in public shame and endure the taunts and abuses with their own words condemning them as traitors. I think I am just going to pause for a moment and consider the 100 Flowers campaign and what it tells us about the kind of person Mao was. He seems, at least, pretty thin-skinned. If you want to make the case that he was a great-souled, enlightened leader, you have to get past the 100 Flowers campaign. This 100 Flowers campaign had a chilling effect on the entire population. No one in the entire country dared to criticize Mao. I know I've wandered far afield in introducing the Great Leap Forward. We haven't even gotten to it yet. But these are very important events leading up to it. They are causal events. China gets in debt to the Soviets, follows the Stalin-esque model of collectivization. Stalin dies, Khrushchev denounces him, Mao feels a little insecure, launches a 100 Flowers campaign, ends up feeling just a little hurt and a little offended when people actually dare to criticize him. So he launches a campaign of brutal repression. And as a consequence, no one dares contradict Mao. Even the party elites will go along with whatever he says. Without these conditions, tens of millions of people could not have died in the Great Leap Forward. So let's begin now with the Great Leap Forward. In 1957, Mao is in absolute control of the party after this anti-rightist campaign. It's in those conditions that he goes to Moscow to meet with Nikita Khrushchev. Mao is no longer the understudy who could be made to wait for 2 days. He doesn't like Khrushchev's West-friendly version of communism. Mao thinks that his Stalin-esque model is the only way to achieve a socialist utopia. So he becomes a little competitive. He wants to prove his socialism is better than Khrushchev's socialism. When Khrushchev announces that he's going to match U.S. industrial output in the next 15 years, Mao doesn't want to be outdone. He announces that China is going to match Great Britain's industrial output in the same length of time. So Mao's goal might have sounded more modest, but the truth was China was a lot farther behind Great Britain than the Soviet Union was behind the United States of America. So Mao's goal was more ambitious than Khrushchev's. To accomplish that goal, in 1958, he announced the second of his 5-year plans, what he called the Great Leap Forward. And of course, there was quite a bit of fanfare that went along with this. The Communist Party pumped out songs and slogans to whip up the masses. One of those slogans I find a little ironic. It was the main slogan, in fact, especially considering the 100 Flowers campaign and subsequent clampdown was "Dare to think, dare to act." Why the Chinese Communist Party would want to encourage its citizens to think is beyond me. But that was the slogan, "Dare to think, dare to act." Another slogan that spread around the countryside was coined by one of Mao's high-ranking deputies. "Hard work for a few years, happiness for 1,000. Not really sure what that means. You work hard enough for 5 years, and crops would start to plant themselves. The whole country would become one big perpetual motion machine of bliss. But people took up these slogans enthusiastically. Mao was nothing if not a master propagandist. And his goal was to dramatically increase two things: industrial output, primarily, and agricultural output. To get to the levels Mao wanted, he would need infrastructure. So the first thing he did was try to build a system of dams and roadways and rails. Now, he didn't have very many modern pieces of equipment, but one thing he had in spades was manpower. So he conscripted, get this, 100 million peasants to build infrastructure around China, working in incredibly primitive conditions, at times scraping out roads with their bare hands. But early on, even in those conditions, morale was very high. Mao would actually go out to the various work sites and congratulate the workers and cheer them on. So far so good. But I don't really even know how to introduce this next part. Also very early in the Great Leap Forward, Mao identified a deadly enemy of the Chinese people, of the Communist Party. An enemy so powerful that it would utterly prevent the Chinese people from entering their socialist utopia unless it was crushed. So Mao mustered all of the outrage of the Chinese people against this enemy. This time it wasn't his eternal enemy, the rightists. It wasn't the United States of America, it wasn't the Soviets, it wasn't Japan. Mao declared all-out, total annihilation warfare against the sparrow. That's right, the sparrow. I'm not making this up. That's why you didn't need the onion in 1950s China, just like you don't need it in the United States today. This is what Mao said about sparrows, and really birds in general. He said, quote, "Birds are the public animals of capitalism," end quote. That's right, to Mao, nothing said bourgeois greed and proletariat oppression like sparrows. So even if you and I have no idea what Mao is talking about, he did rally his people around this cause. According to some eyewitnesses, citizens would bang pots and pans so that the sparrows couldn't land. They had no chance to rest on the tree branches or the ground. They would fly, terrified by the drums, until they fell dead to the ground. Sparrow nests were destroyed, eggs were broken, chicks were killed. A lot of people, anybody who had a weapon, simply shot sparrows out of the sky, whether it was a gun or a slingshot or whatever they had. And when you have some 600+ million people doing this, sparrows very quickly were hunted nearly to extinction. In fact, all over China, contests were held to see who could bring in the most dead sparrows. And the winning school or factory or enterprise or what have you would be awarded medals of valor and patriotism. I kid you not, if you think this is all farce, let me read you an article from a Shanghai newspaper in 1958. Of course, it's translated, but this is what it says. Quote, "On the early morning of December 13, the citywide battle to destroy the sparrows began. In large and small streets, red flags were waving. On the buildings, in the courtyards, open spaces, roads, farm fields, there were numerous scarecrows, sentries, elementary and middle school students, government office employees, factory workers, farmers, and PLA, People's Liberation Army, shouting their war cries. In one district, they produced over 80,000 scarecrows and more than 100,000 colorful flags overnight. In the city and in the outskirts, about half of the labor force was mobilized into the anti-sparrow army. Usually the young people were responsible for trapping, poisoning, and attacking the sparrows, while the old people and the children kept sentry watch. Never know where the sneak sparrow attack is coming from, I guess. The factories in the city committed themselves into the war effort even as they guaranteed that they would continue their production levels. In the parks, cemeteries, and hothouses where there were fewer people around, 150 free fire zones were set up for shooting the sparrows. The Nanyang Girls Middle School Rifle Team received training in the techniques for shooting birds. Thus, the citizens fought a total war against the sparrows. By 8 p.m. that night, it is estimated that a total of 194,432 sparrows have been killed. End quote. So, about 200,000 sparrows in one district in one day. About the only places the sparrows could land, at least in the cities, was at foreign embassies. When the sparrows landed at the Polish embassy, they were surrounded by Chinese citizens demanding that they let them in to kill the sparrows. The Polish embassy denied their request, so people surrounded the embassy. Thousands of people banging on drums. And even though the sparrows were inside the embassy at the time, it was so unnerving to them that they took to the air and dropped from the sky dead before they would land again. This went on for 2 whole days until all the sparrows were dead. Polish embassy workers had to use shovels to clean up all the dead sparrows. So this, I don't know how you describe it. Heroic and valiant war effort went on for a couple of years. But in April 1960, somebody brought something very inconvenient to Mao's attention. An ornithologist pointed out that sparrows don't just eat grain. They also eat a lot of insects, which might be why the rice yields were falling through the floor, as all the sparrows were killed off. So Mao ordered an end to the killing of sparrows. He replaced them with a new enemy, bedbugs. But of course, by that time, it was way too late. With no sparrows to eat them, locust populations ballooned, and plagues of locusts spread around China, destroying crops everywhere they went. Suddenly, the sparrow became a most favored bird, and there were harsh penalties for killing a single sparrow. And China ended up having to pay Russia to import hundreds of thousands of sparrows back into their country. This war on sparrows is stupid enough in its own right to have its own standalone episode as one of the dumbest things in history. But when you realize it was just the opening salvo in the Great Leap Forward, and not even the worst decision, not even the biggest contributor to the loss of life during this famine, then you get an idea of the magnitude of what we're dealing with here. Another important contributor to the starvation of the time was the collectivization of the farms. Throughout the 1950s, there was progressive increase in collectivization, both in the number of farms collectivizing and in the size of those collectives. Early in the 1950s, they had mutual aid teams between 5 and 15 families, joining together to make their agriculture more efficient, but keeping their own property. 1953 saw the first of the elementary agricultural cooperatives of between 20 and 40 families. By 1956, they were forming higher cooperatives of between 100 and 300 families, so small town-sized farming cooperatives. And this was encouraged by the party. The peasants could keep their own land, but they could join together to be more efficient in their farming. These cooperatives, these collectives, could sell their product wherever they wanted to. They weren't restricted in what they had to plant, how much they had to sell it for, and where they had to sell it. So there were, we have to admit, some good things about that arrangement. But that was all about to change during the Great Leap Forward. Mao was about to go full Stalin mode. He was going to force these farmers onto communes, where the rules would be very different. In 1958, Mao declared that, quote, "The People's Commune will be the bridge that will carry China towards the socialist paradise," end quote. And rather than wait for these stubborn peasants to catch his vision, he simply forced them onto communes. Households all over China were forced onto state-owned communes. And not only were the communes much more common, they were much larger than the farmers' cooperatives. Up to 2,000 families formed one commune. And life on the commune was nothing like private life. It was basically a giant military barracks. It was run by a group called a cadre or a cadre, depending on which country you're in. A cadre was a small group of people, Communist Party members, who oversaw life for everybody else on the commune. And they had a tremendous amount of power. Again, it was almost a military arrangement. The cadres oversaw who did what kind of work, who slept where, who slept with whom, who ate what, and often without any kind of expertise or formal training. They simply carried out the orders from the party members higher up. And as you can imagine, this arrangement was not very popular with the peasants in the countryside. Implementation usually meant summoning the households in the area to a big party meeting and not letting them stay there until they signed on to the commune idea, keeping them there for days and exerting a tremendous amount of pressure on them to force them to join these communes. And once they were in, they were in. Life was very hard on these communes. Now look, I don't want to exaggerate. Life had probably always been very hard for peasants in rural China up to that time. But the communes, which were claimed by Mao to improve peasant life, did anything but improve peasant life. The workday was very long. It began usually at dawn and often went late into the night. Farming had always been a sun-up until sundown affair before this. But the most zealous of the cadres, overseeing the most zealous communes, would set up lights so that the peasants could keep working the fields late into the night. Mao insisted that the communes fuel his industrial revolution, raise plenty of food for the workers in the city, as well as enough food to sell to help pay off China's debt. So the work was backbreaking, and anyone who could possibly pitch in had to work. And aside from the harshness of the labor, every single aspect of your life was rearranged on the commune. It was nothing like the life that you had been forced to leave behind. Imagine what a shock that could be to your psyche. All private property was abolished. Your home could be commandeered or torn down to get parts to make the commune dwellings. And millions of people lost their homes during this time. Your best shovel, knife, pots, pans, sheep, pigs, all of it belonged to the collective. It didn't matter how hard you'd worked, how much you'd scrimped and saved to try to build something for yourself. It was all taken for the collective, for the communes. But it gets even more oppressive than that. You were not allowed to cook or eat at home at all. All cooking and eating had to be done at the communal kitchen. And the thing I find the most difficult to accept that people went along with was that the family unit was abolished. Children were looked after, or farmed out to, communal schools and nurses and daycares. Now, on the one hand, Mao would claim, and he was right, that he had emancipated women from their maternal duties. They were now free to work alongside the men. That sounds all well and good, but the fact is, what were they freed up to do? To work like slaves, to work themselves to death in the fields. So that was some emancipation. When they got done working, they came home to their own barracks. So the women had one set of barracks, the men another. It didn't matter if you were married or not. You slept in the men's barracks if you were a man and the women's barracks if you were a woman. They would even control who could sleep with whom when. And if a man and a woman were found out to be having sex, even if they were married, they were denounced and punished. According to the Hong Kong historian Yang Shang, there are many cases where this denunciation for having sex was so shameful to the women, even the married women, that many of them committed suicide rather than face the humiliation. In many of the communes, money was abolished. You were not allowed to have any money. Instead, they set up a system of work points. You could trade your work points for food in the communal kitchen. Since you weren't allowed to have private property, that kind of makes sense. The only thing you could get with your work points was food. And if you didn't have enough work points, you didn't eat. And they meant it. This food rationing was controlled with very harsh measures. Frank Dikotter, the Hong Kong historian, once again, went through some of the archives, some of the records of this time. He found that you could be beaten to death, and people were, for stealing a single handful of grain. In another account, get this, a man stole a single potato. And the rest of this gets a little murky, but I think you'll get the idea. It says he had his legs tied up with iron wire, a 10-kilo stone dropped onto his back, one of his ears cut off, and his flesh branded with a hot iron. And that is not even close to the worst of it. In one small village of Hunan province, he found records of a local leader who forced a father to bury his son alive for stealing one handful of grain. To quote Dikotter, across the country, from archive to archive, there are abundant examples of the use of extraordinary levels of violence to get people to do things they weren't very keen on doing. A little understatement there. He says people were drenched in urine, covered in excrement. They were buried alive, had their noses and ears chopped off. End quote. Along with these horrors of commune life, The peasants not only had to fulfill their grain quotas, they would also line up men, women, children, all these people in their farm clothes, and drill them in military discipline. So marching around, thrusting bayonets, shouting death to the Americans, down with the nationalists, kill the imperialists, whatever it was. This was commune life. And we have to remember, these are men, women, and children, just like you and me. Think how much you would like that situation. Well, that's how much they liked it. The cadre told them everything that they had to do in their lives. It told them when they were going to get up in the morning, where they were going to work, what their duties would be, how long they would have to work, how much food they would get during the day between their shifts, and how late they had to stay out in the fields before going to bed. It controlled where they slept, who they slept with, and then it started all over again the next morning, with the overall goal being to dramatically increase grain production. And you can imagine just how well this worked, exactly as well as Mao's War on the Sparrows. And here again, someone might have pointed out to Mao the fact that people who have zero quality of life, nothing to live for, aren't very motivated to work hard. Productivity fell through the floor. To make the low yields even lower, peasants who were actually experienced in farming were silenced. The ideologues who knew nothing about caring for the harvest were put in charge, and they instituted all kinds of reforms, methods that seemed to them very likely to dramatically increase grain yields, but of course backfired spectacularly. Experienced peasant farmers knew kind of which crops would grow where, how far apart you should plant the seeds, how deep you should plant them. But of course, ideologues, party officials, have a very hard time accepting reality. They didn't want to hear any of those limitations. They didn't want to hear that you had to space plants out. Plant them right on top of the other. Then just dump gobs and heaps of fertilizer on top of them. After all, if the plants are 9 inches apart, that gives you twice as much yield as plants that are 18 inches apart. It all makes perfect sense. Of course, early on, there were some peasants who actually knew what they were talking about, who said this isn't going to go well at all. But they were treated as naysayers, rightists, obstructionists. And if they didn't want to get sent to some kind of re-education camp, they had to just shrug their shoulders and get on the Titanic with everybody else. But this whole thing left their best talent, their best farming talent, disillusioned and detached. So to try to boost motivation, all the music, all the art and poetry, all of it extolled the great virtues of socialism, of Mao's Great Leap Forward. People were subjected to a constant barrage of propaganda, and the party set up a series of productivity awards and contests throughout the country. The commune with the highest production, or at least the best ability to lie about their production numbers, got honors and kudos and visits by high-ranking party members. But the low-producing communes, or those who couldn't lie as well, faced censure, condemnation, humiliation, ridicule, you name it. So there was every incentive to claim very high production numbers. And I say claim because that's exactly what they did. It's so much easier to claim you're meeting expectations and quotas than to actually meet them. So lying became ubiquitous. From the lowliest field hand to the highest party official, everyone inflated the production numbers, and everybody knew that everyone else was doing the same thing. And on the one hand, I have no problem with that line. In fact, it's great. If the party wanted to work people to death, demanding that they produce something totally unreasonable, then they deserve to be lied to. Peasants lied to the cadres lied to the party, and that's exactly what Mao's party deserved. The problem is, it had very deadly consequences. It is one of the most deadly aspects of the Great Leap Forward. Taxes were calculated based on production, but of course not actual production. They were based on reported production. So if you inflate your production numbers, your taxes are commensurately higher. All of your crop is going to go to Beijing. Because you claim to have grown so much more than you actually did, there's very little left to feed your commune. And so that's exactly what happened in case after case. And it resulted in mass starvation and widespread death. So let's review. So far I've talked about the war against the sparrows and the resultant plagues of insects, the forcing of peasants into communes where they had no quality of life, they were miserable and demotivated. Communes were run by zealots who were ignorant of farming, the close planting of crops, over-fertilization, deep planting, all of those things that lowered crop yields, and the incentivization of exaggerating, of lying, in other words, about how much you were producing. All of these factors contributed in setting up the disaster that was the Great Leap Forward. But there were other factors at play also. And one of those was Mao Zedong's obsession with steel. Steel to him was the visible manifestation of progress. When Mao said he wanted to match Great Britain's industrial output in 15 years, what he really meant was their steel output. Steel was industry, and industry was steel. So at the beginning of the Great Leap Forward, August 1958, in the Politburo meetings, Mao decided that steel production had to double in 1959 over 1958. To accomplish this, Mao invested huge amounts of resources and set up thousands of mills and plants, large-scale projects. Every single year, thousands of them went up across China. These thousands of large-scale projects required millions of workers to run them. So China was adding millions of people to its industrial state payroll every single year to run these plants. That sounds like progress, all very exciting. And if it weren't for two inconvenient facts, it might have been. The first fact is that all of these workers had to eat too. They get hungry just like everybody else. So that created a huge amount of stress on China's food rationing system. So that was one problem. The next problem was they were throwing these factories up so quickly that there was no coordination. Material shortages were the rule, not the exception. So they had millions in fact, of able-bodied workers, thousands and thousands of new factories, but no materials for them to work with. So how do you balance that book? The cost of building all these factories was enormous. The cost of wages for all these workers is skyrocketing, and yet you don't have a corresponding increase in material that you can sell. You can't raise any money. And you consume a huge amount of the nation's food resources to pay workers who are sitting around in factories that don't have raw materials, so they're not producing anything. A total failure of central planning. This discussion now brings me to what I consider the most visible symbol of the pathetic futility of the Great Leap Forward, the backyard blast furnace. Mao and the party realized that even with all the resources they were spending on steel production, they couldn't meet their goals. So in September of 1958, some petty sycophantic official or other showed Mao a small blast furnace sitting in someone's backyard. The official told Mao that this little backyard blast furnace was churning out high-quality steel, tons of it, which of course it wasn't because that's impossible. But Mao's more of a can-do kind of guy, so he accepts it uncritically and believes he's found the solution to China's steel demand needs. Every neighborhood, every commune is going to have a blast furnace and become a steel mill unto itself. So once again, the bedraggled masses have to start building blast furnaces everywhere throughout China. Of course, there aren't nearly enough bricks to accomplish any of this, so most of these blast furnaces are built out of mud and human hair to hold it together. Blast furnaces have to be hot, and to make a very hot fire takes a lot of fuel. So this had all the makings of another environmental catastrophe, and that's exactly what it was. Entire forests were denuded of all trees to get enough wood to throw into the furnace. When that ran out, which it did pretty quickly, doors from peasants' houses, furniture, even coffins were dug up to try to fuel the fires. The raw materials for this steel consisted of pots and pans, bikes, utensils, farming equipment. Pretty much any piece of metal they could get their hands on went into the blast furnace to make steel. These were not useless items. In many cases, useful items were being thrown into the blast furnace to try to make steel. Of course, with thousands, if not millions of these blast furnaces cropping up all over China, millions of workers were diverted from the fields. I guess if this had worked, they could have sold the steel, and it would have all been worth it. The problem is, you don't just throw a bunch of metal objects into a blast furnace made of mud and human hair and pull high-quality steel out of that oven. It's a skilled art that requires an iron master, and that's the problem. Mao, like so many people of his ilk, had a deep abiding mistrust of people who knew how to do things. If you knew things, he'd be keeping his eye on you. So as a consequence, okay, I'm exaggerating, but not by much. As a consequence, many of the Iron Masters had been purged in some of the anti-rightist campaigns. In areas where there was an Iron Master, these backyard blast furnaces were pretty successful, but those areas were few and far between. The rest of the thousands and thousands, if not millions of blast furnaces produced nothing more than pig iron, economically worthless, totally useless, and so costly. Not just costly in the materials they used up, but the opportunity cost, people who could have been working somewhere else, doing something productive. And this nonsensical make-work went on for a long time, despite the fact that Mao Zedong knew. He knew it was a witness fact that Mao knew that it was all pointless just a couple of months after he began the program. In January of 1959, just months after he started all this, he visited some traditional steelworks in Manchuria, and there he saw clearly that you can only make high-quality steel in a large-scale factory with coal or some other reliable source of fuel. You can't do it with wood you've chopped down from a forest or doors you've pulled off your house. Yet despite this, he allowed peasants to continue to pour a tremendous amount of energy and resources into a feudal program, I think to save face. It was his program, it was his baby, he was reluctant to call it off. But he told his personal physician the reason he allowed it to go on was that, quote, I don't want to dampen the revolutionary enthusiasm of the masses. So Mao knew better, but he didn't want to dampen the revolutionary enthusiasm of the masses. I will just say this, that's one of the most infuriating aspects of authoritarians, this patronizing attitude they have toward their people. Whether it's withholding potentially life-saving information from them, downplaying the seriousness of a situation, or creating a crisis out of something that just doesn't exist. Authoritarians feel no compunction at all about treating adults as little children to serve their own ends. Not an admirable trait in a leader. There are so many factors that went into the humanitarian crisis of the Great Leap Forward. I'll just mention one more, and that is massive engineering projects undertaken without adequate equipment, with mostly human labor, and without the input of trained engineers. So irrigation projects, dams, roads, I've mentioned this before. But the human toll of this was also very high. In early 1958, again, the beginning of the Great Leap Forward, Mao was listening to a report on irrigation from Jiangsu, and he commented on the various projects, saying, quote, Wu claims he can move 30 billion cubic meters. I think 30,000 people will die. Zhou has said that he will move 20 billion cubic meters, and I think that 20,000 people will die. Wei only promises to move 600 million cubic meters. Maybe nobody will die. End quote. Now look, I don't want to mischaracterize this. Mao is not saying that that's a good thing, that about one worker dies for every million cubic meters moved in these massive irrigation projects. But they did understand that there would be a high toll to complete this work. And despite this, the party continued to demand the mass mobilization of irrigation workers. For the next several years, this claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, exhausted, starving villagers. And the casualty rate was so high that people in the regions where these projects were taking place called them killing fields. Getting sent to these massive projects was like getting sent to the killing fields. There are so many things that factor into the Great Leap Forward I can't possibly talk about now, but the results were truly heartbreaking. 1958, when the Great Leap Forward was announced and begun in earnest. That was a year of great weather. It should have been a banner year for crops. Should have been plenty of food, and then some. But because of the policies of the Great Leap Forward, it was a hard year. Too many workers were distracted. They were working at steel production. So entire bumper crops of grain that could have been harvested and stored were left to rot in the fields. There was also that plague of locusts brought on by the sparrow-killing campaign, which devastated a large portion of the crops. So as a result, there was an actual food shortage during a year where the harvest was excellent. The yields were very high, and the death rate among the peasants, especially in rural areas, began to climb. Things got much worse in 1959. There were two factors at play. One was there was a drought in large swaths of China. The other is that the Yellow River flooded. Millions of acres were destroyed by these floods. The spring harvest was dismal in 1959. Despite the poor harvest, local officials were under a tremendous amount of pressure from the central authorities to report record harvests. So of course they over-reported. Beijing raised the taxes based on these false reports, and there wasn't enough food for the people to eat, so starvation began to set in earnest. The question has been addressed through various historians whether or not Mao knew how dire the situation was becoming in the countryside. But according to the evidence of recent historians, there's little doubt that Mao knew about the starvation his policies were causing. The old apologist line was that the regional governors were not telling Mao what was happening. They wanted to paint a rosy picture of what was happening, so they didn't tell him. He had no idea. That's 100% false. The regional governors were actually doing their job. They were reporting the crisis back to Beijing. Information was getting back to Mao about how bad things were in the countryside. Frank Dikotter, for one, has actually read these letters, read the evidence of regional governors, local authorities, reporting back to Mao how severe the humanitarian crisis was in their provinces. So trying to claim that Mao didn't know is not tenable. The other apologist's argument is, even if Mao knew, what could he possibly do? This was a famine. You can't make food up out of thin air. That is also 100% false. Mao had it within his power to improve the situation of the starving peasants. How do we know that? Well, Mao was sending millions of tons of grain to the Soviet Union to repay his debt. And even at the height of the crisis during the Great Leap Forward, he accelerated his repayment schedule, decided to send even more grain to the Soviet Union. Why would he do that, you ask? To show up Khrushchev is the short answer. He wanted to make it seem that China was thriving under his Stalinist-era policies. Everything was going swimmingly. Mao continued also to export grain to other countries to raise money for his steelworks projects. So while the peasants were starving, grain was leaving the country to raise money. In fact, in many communes, the ration of grain fell to an average of 250 grams a day. That's 1/4 kilogram a day to feed a man or woman working 14 hard hours of labor every single day. Well, as people began to starve and die, even communist China couldn't hide what was happening from the outside world. So countries actually offered Mao and the Communist Party to provide food aid to feed their people. Mao refused this categorically because it wasn't consistent with his narrative for his Great Leap Forward. The Japanese foreign minister even offered to provide the aid in total secrecy. The Japanese foreign minister, the old enemy of China, offered to send them 100,000 tons of wheat in a nighttime shipment so nobody would know, none the wiser, and the peasants would be fed. But Mao categorically refused. At one point, President John F. Kennedy was asked about the humanitarian crisis in China. He pointed out that yes, Chinese people were starving at the same time that communist China is exporting food to Africa and Cuba. But Kennedy said, quote, "We've had no indication from the Chinese communists that they would welcome any offer of food," end quote. As the scope of the tragedy was becoming well known, even in China, a party conference was called to address the problems of the Great Leap. And only one party leader dared to even approach Mao and ask him to reconsider some of the policies. That was the hero general of the Korean War, General Peng Dehuai. He asked Mao to, quote, "Please consider the people," end quote. Of course, Mao took that exactly as you would expect a thin-skinned authoritarian to take it. He took it as an insult, and he responded by organizing a purge of General Peng Dehuai and all of his followers. So after the purges of the 100 Flowers campaign, there was only one official who dared to even question Mao, so that official was purged as well. And by purged, I don't mean killed, but his post was shamefully stripped from him. To make matters worse, as conditions got worse and deteriorated through 1959 and 1960, according to the Hong Kong historian Yang Chisheng, the incredible thing was there actually was food right there in the country. There were national grain reserves, ostensibly just for times of crisis like this. In past times, imperial times, when there was a famine, the emperor would release the grain reserves to feed the people. But Mao and the Chinese communists, the so-called Party of the People, refused to allow the grain out. That could have saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives, if they had released the national grain reserves. Starving peasants actually gathered in large numbers around the granaries, begging the officials to open the reserve. But their pleas fell on deaf ears, and more people starved. Mao and Khrushchev met up again pretty early in the Great Leap Forward in 1959. At that meeting, Khrushchev took Mao aside and begged him not to become another Stalin, asked him to please not repeat the mistakes Stalin had made in the Soviets that had resulted in the deaths of millions. Remember, there were still thousands of Soviet economic and political advisors in China at the time. You can predict how Mao responded to that. He resented it. He responded by raising production quotas, demanding even more from his starving people. Khrushchev, of course, wanted nothing to do with this. To his credit, I would say. He suspended the Soviet-Chinese cooperation agreement and called home 15,000 economic advisors, saying in essence, "You've got this, obviously, Mao. You're on your own. I'm washing my hands of it." People in China, meanwhile, were filling their stomachs with tree bark, banana tree leaves, which were very scarce since they'd all been cut down en masse to stoke the useless blast furnaces. People took to eating mice, what they called small white mice, clay, dirt, even lumps of coal just to fill their stomachs, to make them feel less empty. You can imagine the havoc that wreaked in their guts. People who had to eat the dirt and mud often died of bowel obstructions as often as starvation. During the years of the Great Leap Forward, as it progressed, in many areas of the countryside, the fatality rate was about 50%. People working in the fields would just drop dead, and there were not enough people left to bury them. Children can remember seeing their parents collapse in front of them. Thousands of reports of cannibalism came in. They became so common that officials were no longer surprised when they received them. Those who did remain alive began to swell with kwashiorkor, that characteristic swollen belly look of severe protein deficiency. Regions of the countryside where the famine was the most severe were cordoned off. The government wanted to hide how severe the famine was, and it also didn't want to allow these starving peasants to travel elsewhere in search of food. When peasants tried to flee to the cities to get some food, they were intercepted and sent back to the country. In the cities, food was rationed, but the starvation wasn't nearly as severe. But if you tried to get to a city to get food, you were sent right back to the country as soon as you were caught. As is often the case during times of humanitarian crises, human rights and human dignity were early casualties. Remember earlier I said that the communes were run by a cadre or cadre, depending on your country, these small groups of individuals trained in party ideology. Well, the famine, the shortage of food, gave the cadre almost unlimited power over life and death, over their people, power which in many instances they were all too happy to exercise. The cadre could withhold food to punish you, to the point that people actually died, and they could increase rations among their favorites as a reward. So there was rampant exploitation and abuse of all forms, and I mean all forms. The reports are heartbreaking. During the scarce times, the starving times during the Great Leap Forward, the saying, "He who does not work shall not eat," was applied in full. It was taken literally. If you were old, sick, weak, or pregnant, if you couldn't work, in other words, you didn't get any food. You would be cut off from your rations and starved to death. Typically, when you read about this time, you hear about the starvation. But according to Jasper Becker, what you don't hear about, which you should hear about, are the human rights abuses during the Great Leap Forward and during Mao's leadership in general. According to Becker, mass killings are not usually associated with Mao and the Great Leap Forward, and China continues to benefit from a more favorable comparison with Cambodia or the Soviet Union. But as fresh and abundant archival evidence shows, coercion, terror, and systematic violence were the foundation of the Great Leap. And between 1958 and 1962, by a rough approximation, some 6 to 8% of those who died were tortured to death or summarily executed, amounting to at least 3 million victims. Now look, if you presented that number to the Chinese Communist Party today, they would push back hard against it. They would say that that is sensationalist propaganda. And I don't claim to know what the actual number is. I have to rely on the fact that every serious historian who has studied this time agrees that there were millions of people who died violent deaths at the hands of the party, who were tortured and executed, in addition to those who died of the famine. Some of these deaths occurred during what were called public criticism sessions. These were sessions that were used to intimidate and shame the peasants who didn't obey their local officials. According to the historian Ralph Thaxton, this increased the death rate in several ways. He says this, quote, "In the first case, blows to the body caused internal injuries that, in combination with physical emaciation and acute hunger, could induce death," end quote. I like that term, induce death. What it means is that the party cadres were killing people who were too weak and sickly to withstand the physical punishment of these public criticism sessions. He tells the story of one peasant who stole 2 cabbages from the common fields. He was forced to endure for 1/2 a day people coming and criticizing him, shouting at him, and beating him. He collapsed, fell ill, and died shortly thereafter. Thousands of others were sent to labor camps, to re-education camps, and the death rate there was over 70%. Sending people to labor camps was just a way to inflict capital punishment with plausible deniability. According to Dikotter again, around 6 to 8% of those people who died during the Great Leap Forward were tortured to death or summarily killed. He states that beatings with sticks were the most common method used by the local cadres, and that about half of the cadres employed this method. He goes on, quote, "Other cadres devised harsher means to humiliate and torture those who failed to keep up. As mass starvation set in, ever greater violence had to be inflicted in order to coerce malnourished people to labor in the fields. Victims were buried alive, thrown bound into ponds, stripped naked and forced to labor in the middle of the winter, doused in boiling water, forced to ingest excrement and urine, and subjected to mutilation, hair ripped out, noses and ears lopped off. In Guangdong, some cadres injected salt water into their victims with needles normally reserved for cattle." End quote. And you didn't even have to be a thief to be punished this way. In fact, according to Benjamin Valentino, quote, "Communist officials sometimes tortured and killed those accused of failing to meet their grain quota." End quote. In 1959, Liu Shaoqi was elected president of China. Although Mao remained the head of the Communist Party, Mao was still the real power in China. But Liu wanted to restrain some of Mao's abuses, to find out what was really going on. But it took him another year. It took him until 1960 to actually send officials around the country to study the effects of the Great Leap Forward. 3 officials called every single province to get the report of the death toll from famine. They came up with a number in the tens of millions. If you wonder how the party responded to this report, wonder no longer. Mao ordered the report destroyed immediately. The official report was burned. There are no copies of it remaining. Even though the final report was burned, historians have been able to go back to the individual provinces and review some of the documents that went into making up that report. And what they find is misery and suffering on an unimaginable scale, sprinkled with one horrifying vignette after another. So even after the national report was destroyed, the small regional reports remain. In 1961, the president of China, Liu Shaoqi, went to his home province of Hunan to investigate. Many of his own family members and friends had died of starvation, unbeknownst to him. Somehow he was out of the loop. The cadres had hidden that information from him. So as the evidence began to mount, as people could no longer deny what was happening, especially Mao, as he could no longer hide what was happening, the entire bungled scheme, the whole Great Leap Forward, was called to a halt in 1962. All of the catastrophic policies were reversed, so the cadres disbanded, the communes disbanded. Planting and harvesting was taken up again by experienced farmers. Farmers could sell their products on the open market. Private land, private property was restored. The backyard blast furnaces, I hate to say, were abandoned. Quotas and production demands were stopped. The forced confiscation of grain was stopped. I have to say, I think Liu Shaoqi acquitted himself very nicely in this affair. But when there's a dictator around, no good deed goes unpunished. So a few years later, during what Mao called the Great Cultural Revolution, he had Liu arrested, imprisoned without medical care, and Liu died in 1969. All of which makes me confess with great shame that I was wrong in my list of the top 10 worst people ever. Very, very wrong, in fact. But that's a topic for another time. Instead, I now want to calculate the balance sheet for the Great Leap Forward, to see why I think it is not even a question that this is the dumbest thing in all history. In the history of our species, I can't find anything dumber. That's quite a claim, but let me back it up. Remember, to be one of the dumbest things ever, you can't just be misguided. You can't just fail to meet your stated objectives. You have to fail on a world historical scale. And here the Great Leap Forward does not disappoint. But first, let's consider the pros, the good things that came out of the Great Leap Forward. First, women were emancipated, freed from domestic chores to a great extent. Secondly, before the Great Leap Forward, landowners did abuse their peasants. So the landowners were dead, and they could no longer abuse their peasants. Thirdly, this is a little surprising. Mao had a goal for the amount of steel he wanted produced, and China actually met that goal during the Great Leap Forward. Unless people were lying, which of course they were. But China officially at least met the goal for the amount of steel it wanted to produce. And finally, one of the stated objectives during the Great Leap Forward was to eradicate sparrows from China. And we have to admit, Mao totally killed it on that one. When everything was said and done, he could claim total domination over the sparrow population in China. So those are the pro side of the balance sheet, if you can even call them that. Now let's go to the cons, some of the downsides of the Great Leap Forward. First, although the women were emancipated, all they were really freed up to do was work to death in the fields and chop off all their hair to help build blast furnaces. So it's not exactly what somebody like Susan B. Anthony would have been going for. The second item on the con side of the balance sheet is that even though there were tons of steel produced, they were useless pig iron tons of steel. So achieving production goals was a Pyrrhic victory indeed. Thirdly, the campaign against the sparrows was a victim of its own success. We've pointed this out several times now. The locusts ate up more crops than the sparrows ever could have, and they ended up having to import hundreds of thousands of sparrows when their blunder became obvious. By the way, the estimated number of dead sparrows was 1 billion. 1 billion dead sparrows during that campaign. The next con is that nearly every tree in China was gone. Huge swaths of forest disappeared, cut down and thrown into the useless blast furnaces to make pig iron. Entire ecosystems were destroyed throughout China due to this deforestation and the widespread overuse of pesticides and fertilizers. The next way in which the Great Leap Forward did not meet its stated objectives was in grain yields. Grain production year over year dropped in China. In 1959, there was 15% less grain than 1958. By 1960, it was 30% less than 1958. So crop yields were way down. Another negative was that families were broken. Families were destroyed. Children taken from their parents, parents sent to concentration or work labor camps never to return, or they simply died. So millions and millions of people throughout China were untethered from that family connection through Mao's Great Leap Forward. But I know there's one statistic that overrides all of these, the one that you probably wonder the most about, and that is how many people actually died during the Great Leap Forward. This is a very difficult number to come up with, especially when you consider that the total population of China at the time was not known to within 50 or 100 million people. But to make this short, estimates range from between 23 million at the extremely low end to 55 million at the high end. Most now think that there might have been around 35 to 38 million excess deaths during the Great Leap Forward. And by excess deaths, they mean people who would not have died, but who did die because of famine or violence because of the policies of the Great Leap Forward. 35 to 38 million excess deaths. So when you count up that balance sheet, I think it's pretty easy to see why I consider the Great Leap Forward one of the worst failures, one of the dumbest things ever in history. With that, I will conclude this episode of the History of Being Human podcast. Thank you again for listening, for your support. Thank you for the emails. Please feel free to contact me at thobhpodcast@gmail.com.